Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a briefing by a man who I frankly can't find enough superlatives to describe. I'm going to give it my best shot. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy, and we are really thrilled to be able to welcome to you and through particularly the media, a much larger audience, a man who has acquitted himself in any number of capacities with such distinction that, as I say, my modest vocabulary fails me. Andy McCarthy is, of course, a distinguished public servant, having served as, among other things, a chief assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, in which capacity he successfully prosecuted an extraordinarily dangerous conspiracy aimed at trying to destroy the World Trade Center the first time, back in 1993, and had in its crosshairs a number of other sites, many of them in the New York area. It resulted in the conviction of the blind Sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman, and his co-conspirators, which is a a matter of considerable interest at the moment, as the new president, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, is insisting on his release. I suspect Andy may want to speak to that. Subsequent to his departure from government, Andy has continued with great effect to contribute to the public policy debate and decision process, not least in the area that kind of forms the nexus between, on the one hand, national security and on the other, the law. Few people do it, I think, better than he. He has become a very valued advisor to the United States Congress. He is a brilliant essayist in, among other outlets, National Review Online, where he has a regular featured column, and also Pajamas, or now PJ Media. And he is also the author of numerous best-selling books, many of them dealing very directly with the subject at hand, namely Willful Blindness, The Grand Jihad, How Obama Embraces Islam's Sharia Agenda, and a book that I'm particularly proud he contributed mightily to, Sharia, The Threat to America, a volume of what's known as Team B2, 19 experts in various aspects of national security and foreign policy, many of them with considerable command of Sharia and the Islamist threat, who put together what I think remains one of the most important primers on the challenge that we face from the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations, specifically from its civilization jihad. Not least, Andy is, as you will see shortly, a remarkable human being. A man who is articulate, thoughtful, rigorous in his analysis. He is an outstanding patriot, a most valued colleague, and I'm very proud to say a great friend. We're here today to discuss, thanks in no small measure to Andy's collected works, those of many others, including the Center for Security Policy. I'm happy to say, which features most recently an online curriculum that we've produced called the Muslim Brotherhood in America, The Enemy Within. It's available for free at muslimbrotherhoodinamerica.com. We have also, of course, had most recently 5 courageous legislators, Congresswoman Michele Bachmann, Congressman Trent Franks, Louie Gohmert, Lynn Westmoreland, and Tom Rooney, join forces to ask the sorts of questions that we hope to begin to address with you all today. Namely, what is going on with the policies that are being increasingly adopted by the Obama administration that bring them, it seems, ever more into alignment with the desires, the ambitions, the goals of the Muslim Brotherhood? And to what extent, if at all, are individuals who either are in the government's employ or are being used by advisors by the government or as liaisons to the Muslim American community contributing to the adoption of such policies? As I say, few people have contributed more to the debate that we need on this, and I'm very pleased to say, I think as a result, in part, again, of Andy's leadership, that battle is now being joined. Across America, we're finding people awakening to a very real problem, not from all Muslims, let me be clear about that, and I'm sure Andy will be as well, but from those who adhere to Sharia and seek to impose it on the rest of us. And to the extent that this issue will, as I hope it does from here forward, become more of a focus of national debate and perhaps a decisive factor in the coming election, this conversation may prove to be of historic importance. So with that, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Andy McCarthy.
Well, thank you so much, Frank, for those kind words. As somebody who's had to get a security clearance any number of times during a lengthy law enforcement career, I've been, I must say, baffled by this whole situation. And let me ask you to imagine a scenario. A candidate for a high position in an executive branch agency, a position that entails a great deal of influence over public policy, a position that requires access to highly classified information, comes in to be interviewed by an FBI agent for a background investigation. This is routine. Even people being considered for low-level positions in the executive branch are subjected to background investigations. It's not because we question their patriotism. It's not because we question their honesty or suggest that they're bad people. It is simply something that is a matter of common sense, as well as a good deal of both statutory law and regulation. Naturally, as government positions get higher and more important and more sensitive, the background investigations get more detailed, probing not only a candidate's background, experience, finances, and associations, but those of the candidate's close family members. One matter that is of particular importance is connections to foreign countries, organizations, persons, and movements. There's an entire section devoted to these concerns in Form 86, which is the form that anybody who's looking for a national security clearance in the government has to fill out and be investigated on. So let's assume that our hypothetical candidate truthfully completes the form. What do you suppose the FBI agent is thinking as he flips through the form, asks some follow-up questions, and gets the following story from the candidate? I've worked for a dozen years at an institute that was founded by a wealthy, influential Saudi who is intimately involved in the financing of terrorism. Are you just speculating about that, the candidate is asked? Speculating? No, I'm not speculating. You see, the Saudi guy actually started an ostensible charity that the United States government has designated as a terrorist organization. It's designated as a terrorist because it lavishly funded Al-Qaeda, you know, the jihadist network that we're at war with. As a matter of fact, one of the men this Saudi guy brought in to help him run the specially designated terrorist organization was so close to Osama bin Laden, he actually helped him start the Al-Qaeda network. The agent figures, you gotta be kidding me. I guess you didn't know who this Saudi guy was who was funding Al-Qaeda, right? And our candidate answers, well, as a matter of fact, we overlapped for 7 years at the institute I worked at. Remember, I told you he's the one who started it, and I eventually worked there for 12 years. Well, it turns out he stayed involved in it for decades. It was his baby. He gave the institution its mission and its vision. He was still there advising it, helping it take shape during my first 7 years when I was working there. Then they took him off the masthead. They happened to take him off the masthead at about the same time he was named in a civil suit by the victims of the 9/11 attack. The agent, of course, is stunned. All he can think to ask is, well, why did you leave the institute? And our candidate responds, I got offered a full-time position at the State Department, helping the Secretary of State make American foreign policy. Now, I must say, I wish that was a far-fetched story. To back up for a second, let me first thank you all for being here, and thank Frank again for those kind words. I came to Washington at his suggestion and at the suggestion of my other friends at the Center for Foreign Policy because, as Frank mentioned, I've been writing about this issue. I've been writing about the Muslim Brotherhood for a number of years, and for the past couple of weeks I've been writing about the particular thing that brings us here together today, which is the fact that 5 members of Congress had the temerity to notice that there seems to be an infiltration of Muslim Brotherhood influence in our government. I think I was also asked here because I used to work for the Justice Department, as Frank also mentioned. I was there for about 25 years. At first, I was at the U.S. Marshal Service as a deputy marshal in the Witness Protection Program. And then I was a prosecutor for almost 20 years, as Frank also mentioned. And during that time, I handled or I supervised a number of national security investigations, which generally means terrorism cases, always involving attacks plotted by violent jihadists. I was also involved in a number of investigations that involved national or international organized crime groups, which were often violent in nature. So based on that experience, I guess that was the main reason to come down and talk about this today. But I have to confess that I think the controversy here is baffling. I don't understand why more people in Washington from both parties have not rallied in support of Congresswoman Bachmann, Congressman Gohmert, Franks, Westmoreland, and Rooney. At a time when government policy is being radically harmonized with the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood, meaning policy has shifted in the direction of avowed enemies of the United States, what ought to shock people is that there's any controversy whatsoever over what I think is really a matter of common sense. The 5 House members are simply asking that the inspectors general in pertinent government agencies conduct internal inquiries and report back to Congress about potential Islamist influences at those agencies. Yeah, sure. Now, let me be clear. I mentioned Islamist influences, and I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I purposely used the term Islamist. I did not say Muslims. I don't know how many Muslims work in the U.S. government, but I feel pretty safe saying there are probably thousands. As a federal prosecutor on terrorism cases, I had the privilege of serving with many of them. They were patriotic American Muslims, a number of them who were not Americans, but were people who had embraced America and the West. Without those people, we could not have infiltrated the jihadist networks in New York in the 1990s. Without their help, we couldn't have gotten the evidence that we collected. We couldn't have whipped it into a compelling narrative for a jury. It's worth underscoring that pro-American Muslims serve honorably in our government, in our military, in our intelligence services, and in our major institutions. We're lucky to have them because they have embraced the culture of individual liberty that is the beating heart of Western civilization. They've accepted the premise of our society that everyone has a right to freedom of conscience and equality before the law. They've accepted our foundational principle that people are at liberty to make law for themselves, irrespective of the rules of any belief system or any ideology. They construe Islam's spiritual elements and its laws as a matter of private conscience, not as something that's mandatory as a framework for society. Those Muslims are not Islamists. When we talk about the influence of Islamists, we are referring to Muslims who are beholden to Islamic supremacism. Islamic supremacism is an ideology. It's not a religion. It is a totalitarian social system that would govern every aspect of life down to the granular level. Economic, financial, social, political, military, dietary, matters of crime and punishment, even down to matters of hygiene. That's the Sharia system. As interpreted by many of Islam's most influential thinkers, and what I'm going to refer to as classical Sharia, that is the version of Sharia that's subscribed to by organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and academics like the faculty at ancient Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Classical Sharia rejects basic principles of American constitutional republicanism. In fact, it rejects first and foremost our foundational premise that people are free to determine their own destiny and their own laws, regardless of what Sharia holds. Excuse me. It's the goal of all Islamists to impose Sharia, and that's why I would suggest to you that there is no such thing as a moderate Islamist. If you want to replace the American constitutional system with Sharia and Western civilization with the Islam of the Middle East, you are not a moderate, however grateful we may be that you're not looking to blow up a bridge in order to impose your desires. Whether they are violent or nonviolent, whether they work incrementally toward their goal or at warp speed, the mission of Islamists is always and everywhere to impose Sharia. In Islamist ideology, Sharia is deemed to be the necessary precondition for Islamizing a society. And what Islamists believe is that they are under a divine injunction to do just that. When I talk about Islamists and Islamist influences, that's what I'm talking about. It's essential to understand that Islamic supremacism is not a fringe ideology. And with due respect to the trendy bipartisan diagnosis that has become so popular here in Washington, Islamic supremacism and the extreme forms of behavior that it inspires are not a psychiatric problem. We like to portray the lethal threat against us as violent extremism, but violent extremism does not combust spontaneously. It is caused by Islamic supremacist ideology. Violent extremism, as well as nonviolent extremism, are effects. They are not causes. They are not irrational and wanton. There is a logic to them. I should say an ideologic. This ideology is based on a classical interpretation of Islam that has a rich history. We sound really ignorant around the people who we are trying to persuade when we pretend that that's not the case. Islamic supremacism has been developed over centuries by many of Islam's most respected thinkers, thinkers who are better understood as jurists than clerics because their specialty is Sharia, which is a societal system, again, not just a set of religious principles. And Islamic supremacism is the dynamic ideology of the Middle East at this moment in history. There have been times when it has been dormant and when its worst tendencies have been cabined or suppressed by law, by cultural pressures, or by force. But at this historic moment, Islamic supremacism is once again in its ascendancy. That's a big problem for us. Islamic supremacists mean us grave harm. We are understandably preoccupied by the fact that violent jihadists are taking aim at our lives. But we should not let the immediacy and horror of that threat obscure the fact that the Islamist movement is taking aim at our way of life. The movement's intellectual leader is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is not a largely secular umbrella organization. It is not moderate. It is the vanguard of a ground-up, revolutionary, ideological mass movement. It is sophisticated, patient, and determined. It has spent almost 90 years building its reserves and biding its time. Increasingly over the last century, excuse me, over the last half century, I should say, the efforts of the Muslim Brotherhood have been opulently underwritten by oil wealth, particularly from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis follow a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam called Wahhabism. It's a close cousin of the Brotherhood's interpretation, which is called Salafism. For our purposes, the two streams merge into the supremacist ideology that threatens us today. The threat is very real, very aggressive, and much broader than terrorism. And that's because the underlying threat is not terrorism, but the rationale for terrorism, which is the gradual imposition of classical Sharia by both violence and nonviolence. We hear a lot of chatter today separating the two, trying to separate violent and nonviolent jihad, but they're never really mutually exclusive. The nonviolent jihad is called dawah, the aggressive proselytism of Islam. Dawah is leveraged by the threat of violence. The atmosphere of intimidation is what makes the nonviolent jihad so effective. It is what allows Islamist organizations to exercise such outside influence on our policymaking, considering that Muslims in America barely register about 1% of our population. Not long ago, as Frank mentioned, I wrote a book called The Grand Jihad. The title is not something that I came up with. It was drawn out of an internal Muslim Brotherhood document seized by the FBI from a top Brotherhood operative in Virginia. It was dated 1991, and it was called the Explanatory Memorandum. In it, leading brothers stationed in the United States explained to their global leadership how the brothers saw their mission. Civilization jihad, they called it, and then they elaborated. And let me read from what the memo said. The Ikhwan, that's Arabic for the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers. So it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. See, when Islamists speak among themselves, especially when they don't expect that we'll ever see or hear what they're talking about, they're very clear about what they're trying to do. They're also very clear about who they're trying to do it with. The explanatory memo listed 29 different organizations. Many of them are among the most influential Islamist organizations in the United States. They identified those organizations as their accomplices in this grand jihad. And now, the Brotherhood is in the midst of a gradual triumph in Egypt and the broader Middle East, and that leads brothers to become even more bold in their public pronouncements. So, for example, in October 2010, on the cusp of the revolt, the Brotherhood's supreme guide in Egypt, a man named Muhammad Badi, gave a speech in which he expressly called for violent jihad against the United States. Specifically, Badi urged his fellow Muslims to remember Allah's commandment, this is a quote, to wage jihad for his sake with their money and lives so that Allah's word will reign supreme. Applying that injunction, Badi proclaimed that jihad is the only solution against what he called Zio-American arrogance and tyranny. Not negotiation, jihad. Badi also took delight in noting that the United States had been badly wounded by jihadists in Iraq and Afghanistan. From that, he predicted that America, and this is a quote, is now experiencing the beginning of its end and is heading toward its demise. So, contrary to the increasingly, what seems at least to me to be the increasingly popular belief here in Washington, Islamist influences are not benign. They are not something to yawn over. They are something that we need to defend ourselves against. We're talking about a very determined movement that pulls no punches in braying its intent to destroy our country. The most important Sharia authority in the world, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, the Muslim Brotherhood's chief jurist, proclaims that Islam will conquer America and conquer Europe. And by the way, you'll want to remember Sheikh Qaradawi's name. We'll be coming back to him shortly. Islamists not only tell us that they intend to destroy us, they tell us straight out how they intend to do it, not only by intimidating constant potential violence, but by sabotage. Their word, again, not mine. They will, they say, destroy us from within. They intend to insinuate themselves into our major institutions, including the policy bodies within our government. They intend to compromise us from inside as well as from outside. Where I come from, when serious, competent, threatening people tell you what they're going to do to you and how they're going to do it, that is not something to be ignored. It's something we need to take very seriously. Red eye. The main way I think that we should take it seriously when it comes to our government is to police our agencies so that they are not penetrated by pernicious influences. That is what these 5 members of Congress have tried to do. What is shocking and demoralizing, if you ask me, and what ought to outrage the American people, is that the 5 of them seem to be standing alone. To be clear, the 5 members have not made accusations of criminal wrongdoing. The critics who say they are relying on guilt by association are absurdly mixing apples and oranges. Our bedrock principle against guilt by association has to do with criminal prosecutions. We won't tolerate somebody's liberty being taken away and they're being convicted of a crime just because of who their friends are or what their associates have done. But guilt by association has nothing to do with fitness for high public office. High public office is a privilege, not a right. Access to classified information is a privilege, not a right. You need not have done anything wrong to be deemed unfit for these privileges. It is not a question of your patriotism. It's not a question of your trustworthiness. It is about whether you would be burdened by such obvious conflicts of interest that you would be tempted to act on those interests rather than in the best interests of the United States. It's about whether the American people can have confidence that you are likely to act in the public interest rather than out of bias or favor or intimidation. It's about whether there is a reasonable chance that you would be compromised, not about whether you have been compromised. To be more concrete about it, when I was a prosecutor, the Justice Department would never in a million years have let me handle an investigation that involved members of my family or their friends. That's not because they didn't trust me. It's because it would have been inappropriate. When government acts, it needs to avoid the appearance of impropriety. The legitimacy of government action depends on the public integrity of government action. My DOJ bosses wouldn't make me sit out a case because they thought I'd do something wrong. They'd make me sit out a case because the public might believe I was acting on improper motives. The anxiety about improper motives is a commonplace every place in government. Nothing sends the press and the public into a tizzy quite like the thought that government officials are letting lobbyists weigh in on the formulation of policy. We have rules against former government employees lobbying their old agencies. We have rules against representing both sides of a case. It is expected that government officials will recuse themselves from participating in decisions involving their friends or relatives or former clients. Those rules flow from human nature. They are not an indictment of the trustworthiness or patriotism of the people who happen to be involved. People who work in government, especially if they need security clearances, expect not only to have their own backgrounds scrubbed, they expect that to happen with respect to the backgrounds of their family members and close associates as well. When FBI agents ask those routine questions, they are not just going through the motions. If disturbing facts are developed in the background check of a family member, that can be enough by itself to disqualify a candidate for his position or the position that he seeks. That can be enough for us to draw a rational conclusion that the public would be better served by having somebody who is unconflicted fill the position. If the FBI had asked me about my mother's background and I'd responded by tearing what little hair I have left out and saying, how could you question my patriotism, that wouldn't just have been a good reason to deny me a security clearance. That would have been a good reason to tell me to go find another line of work. And I must tell you, having worked in government for a long time, that is the ethos of government about security clearances. With that as background, and I appreciate you bearing with me for that long background, let me speak to the specific circumstances of Huma Abedin, the Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Clinton. It's worth stressing that the 5 members of Congress sent 5 different letters asking inspectors general at 5 different agencies to conduct internal investigations and report back to Congress. Ms. Abedin was far from the only government official whose name was raised, but she has gotten the most attention. For our purposes today, that's fine because her situation dramatically shows, I think, how badly out of kilter things have become. We've heard all the caterwauling about Islamophobia and, naturally, my personal favorite, McCarthyism. 2 things about that. First, Islamophobia is a term that was manufactured by the Muslim Brotherhood precisely for the purpose of browbeating people into silence about the activities and threat posed by Islamic supremacism. Today, there is no worse sin than to be called a bigot, even if the charge is utterly empty. It's intimidating. It's intended to paralyze people into silence when it is their duty to speak up. And it works. That's why 13 Americans, some of our best and bravest, were killed in a jihadist atrocity in Fort Hood. It's also why the government would rather dismiss Fort Hood as a case of workplace violence than deal with the ideology that caused it. Duty is calling us now, and duty has to be done, even if the grievance industry grieves in overdrive. As for McCarthyism, the truth is that all the demagoguery here has been on the other side. Contrary to the claims that 5 members of Congress have raised, as Senator McCain put it, unspecified and unsubstantiated concerns, they've actually posited some very disturbing factual matters that are quite specific and quite substantial. Rather than address those factual matters, matters that include connections not only to Muslim Brotherhood luminaries, but to an al-Qaeda financier, the response of the Obama administration, congressional Democrats, and their echo chamber in the Republican establishment has been to attack and smear the messengers. Having now spent a good deal of time weighing the competing claims, I'm compelled to say that when it comes to Ms. Abedin's background, the 5 House members have actually understated the case. Their letter to the State Department's Inspector General stated that Ms. Abedin has, and this is a quote, has 3 family members, her late father, her mother, and her brother, connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, connected to Muslim Brotherhood operatives and/or organizations. So they concentrated on the family members. It turns out, however, that Huma Abedin herself is directly connected to Abdullah Omar Nassif, a major Muslim Brotherhood figure who is involved in the financing of al-Qaeda. Ms. Abedin worked for a number of years at the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs as an assistant editor of its journal. The institute was founded by Nassif, who remained active in it for decades, overlapping for at least 7 years with Ms. Abedin. Nassif was also Secretary General of the Muslim World League in Saudi Arabia, perhaps the most significant Muslim Brotherhood organization in the world. As part of the Muslim World League, he founded the Rabita Trust, which is formally designated as a foreign terrorist organization under American law due to its support of al-Qaeda. That is to say, before you even start probing the extensive, alarming Brotherhood ties of Ms. Abedin's family members, she could easily have been disqualified from any significant government position requiring high security clearance based on her own personal, long-standing connection to Nassif. A little more background. At the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs, Ms. Abedin was the assistant editor of the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. The journal promotes the fundamentalist version of Sharia that is championed by the Muslim Brotherhood, by Abdullah Omar Nassif, and by Sheikh Karadawi, who we'll deal with a little bit more in a few minutes. Ms. Abedin was the assistant editor of the journal. The journal was the main product of the Institute. Ms. Abedin was held the position of assistant editor from 1996 through 2008. That's from the time she began working as an intern at the Clinton White House until the time shortly before she took her current position with Mrs. Clinton, with Secretary Clinton, as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State. The Institute was founded by Nassif in the late 70s. He is a hugely influential Saudi who was then vice president of the King Abdul Aziz University in Saudi Arabia. Nassif recruited an academic colleague to be the journal's managing editor. That colleague was Zayed Abedin, Ms. Abedin's late father. Mr. Abedin thus moved his family to Saudi Arabia from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Ms. Abedin was about 2 at the time. Her mother, Dr. Saleha Mahmoud Abedin, is also an academic and worked for the journal from its inception. She would eventually take the journal over when her father died in 1993. She remains its editor to this day. Huma Abedin's brother, Hassan, another academic, is an associate editor at the journal. Now, not long after the journal started, Nassif became the Secretary General of the Muslim World League. As the Washington Post has noted, the Muslim World League was launched by the Muslim Brotherhood with the financial backing of the Saudi royal family. It's often referred to as a charity, but it's really a global propagation enterprise. exporting the Brotherhood's virulently anti-Western brand of Islamist ideology throughout the world, very much including in the United States. There are few positions in the Muslim Brotherhood circles that are more critical than Secretary General of the Muslim World League. In fact, one of the Muslim World League's founders was Saeed Ramadan, the right-hand man and son-in-law of Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim World League is part of the foundation of the Grand Jihad, what the Brotherhood calls its civilization jihad. Nevertheless, the Muslim World League also has a long history of deep involvement in violent jihad as well. It was under the auspices of the Muslim World League in 1998 that Nassif created a charity called the Rabita Trust. To direct the Rabita Trust, Nassif selected Wael Hamza Laden. Laden is not just a member of al-Qaeda, he was a close associate of Osama bin Laden's, so close in fact that he was one of the people who formed al-Qaeda with bin Laden in Afghanistan. According to bin Laden himself, the Muslim World League was one of al-Qaeda's 3 top funding sources. Consequently, after 9/11, Nassif's Rabita Trust was formally designated by the United States government as a foreign terrorist organization. So were branches of what's called the Al-Haramain Islamic Foundation and the International Islamic Relief Organization, which were 2 other Saudi-backed charities that were sprung out of the Muslim World League. Throughout the time that he ran the Muslim World League and the Rabita Trust, Nassif kept his hand in at the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs. In fact, he continued to be listed on the masthead as a member of the advisory editorial board until 2003. We might hazard a guess as to why his name suddenly disappeared after so many decades. Nassif's involvement in funding al-Qaeda was so notorious that in 2004, he was named as a defendant in the civil case brought by victims of the 9/11 atrocities. In 2010, a federal court dropped him out of the suit, not because he was uninvolved, but because a judge reasoned that an American court lacked personal jurisdiction over him. So to summarize, Ms. Abedin had a very lengthy affiliation with an institute founded by a top figure at the nexus between Saudi terror funding, Brotherhood ideology, and al-Qaeda's jihad against the United States. Even if the only pertinent information we had was this personal tie to Nassif, that would be extraordinarily disturbing. But as the 5 House members have pointed out, there's much more. Ms. Abedin's parents were recruited by Nassif to head up the Institute. They obviously had an extremely close relationship with him for over about 4 decades. Besides being the editor of the journal, since her husband died in 1993, Ms. Abedin's mother, again, Dr. Saleha Mahmoud Abedin, has served as a member of the Muslim World League. She also directs an organization that's called the International Islamic Committee for Woman and Child. This committee has been listed as a Muslim World League organization. A top advisor to Dr. Mahmoud's committee is Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi. He, along with several other self-described members of the Muslim Brotherhood, are actually the authors of the committee's charter. As I mentioned earlier, Sheikh Qaradawi is the Muslim Brotherhood's chief Sharia jurist. He is a fierce supporter of Hamas and has issued fatwas supporting suicide bombing against Israel and against American military and support personnel serving in Iraq. Dr. Saleha Mahmoud Abedin's committee describes itself as part of an organization called the International Islamic Council for Dawah and Relief. I know I'm throwing a lot of organizational names at you. As I understand in the materials that were handed out, there's a timeline and also a couple of charts which lay out what these organizations are. As I said, the committee that I described is part of this Islamic Council for Dawah and Relief. Both that committee and the council are components of yet another group, an umbrella organization that's run by Sheikh Qaradawi, which is called the Union for Good. The Union for Good funds and supports violent jihad. It is a designated terrorist organization under American law. Moreover, the International Council for Dawah and Relief is banned in Israel because of its support for Hamas. Organizations aside, there's much that could be said about Dr. Abedin's, this is Huma Abedin's mother's work at the various Muslim Brotherhood affiliates that she's been attached to. The overarching point, though, is this. She is an ardent champion of classical Sharia law. Her committee's website, for example, has called for the repeal of Mubarak-era Egyptian laws that ban female genital mutilation, child marriage, and marital rape. All of those noxious practices find support in classical Sharia law, so she opposes the prohibition of them. Furthermore, the Center for Security Policy has detailed that Dr. Saleha Mahmoud Abedin published and edited a book called Women in Islam, Rights and Obligations. The book appears to have been written by a sister of Abdullah Omar Nassif. It is a Sharia guide to women's issues. It extensively cites Sayyid Qutb, who was the Brotherhood's leading theorist after the death of its founder, Hassan al-Banna. Qutb was executed by the Egyptian government in 1966, and his writings continued to influence jihadist terror organizations, including Al-Qaeda. Women in Islam asserts that man-made laws enslave women and that Sharia is a woman's only escape. The book provides Sharia justification for such practices as the following: female genital mutilation, stoning and lashing as punishments for adultery, the participation of women in violent jihad, prohibiting social interaction between the sexes, requiring women to be veiled, restricting free speech to what benefits Islam, forbidding women to abstain from sexual intercourse on demand by their husbands, requiring women to bar entry to any person into their homes unless their husbands have granted permission, and forbidding the death penalty in cases of apostasy. And that's because Sharia prescribes the death penalty for anyone who apostatizes from Islam. Interestingly, about a year ago, a year before he took to the floor of the United States Senate to attack his House colleagues for raising questions about Ms. Abedin and others, Senator John McCain gave an interview to Der Spiegel in which he pronounced himself unalterably opposed to any role for the Muslim Brotherhood in post-Mubarak Egypt. When the magazine asked Senator McCain what his main objection was to the Brotherhood, he said it's the Brotherhood's promotion of Sharia, which he observed, and this is a quote, is anti-democratic, at least as far as women are concerned. One last point on Ms. Abedin's family members. As I mentioned earlier, her brother, Hassan Abedin, is also affiliated with the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs as an associate editor. In addition, he was a fellow at an Islamic academic institute in Great Britain, the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. During that time, the Oxford Center's board members included Abdullah Omar Nassif and Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi. Let me make a few closing observations. In the end, our system's mainly about political accountability, I think much more so than legal remedies. I want to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of a crime, but our national security and our foreign policy have taken a dangerous turn. That needs to be a campaign issue, regardless of whether the two candidates seem inclined to make it one. The principal policymakers in the Obama administration, it should be stressed, are the President and the top members of his administration, in particular Secretary Clinton when it comes to foreign policy. No one I know, least of all me, is contending that President Obama or Secretary Clinton needed Huma Abedin in order to develop Islamist sympathies. I'd be surprised if Ms. Abedin does not favor the administration's decision to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood as a friend rather than an enemy, but she is not the official who is responsible for that decision. Some of the people highlighted in the letters by the 5 House members have very influential positions, and that is cause for concern because they have a lot to say about how policy gets shaped and how policy gets applied. But no one is claiming that anyone other than the president is ultimately responsible for administration policy. It is also true that presidents and cabinet officials get to consult and seek assistance from pretty much whoever they want. The old adage that elections have consequences is apt here. Cabinet nominations and confirmations have consequences too. If you don't want people with disturbing connections to deeply anti-American organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood to have influence on government officials, then the point is to avoid electing and confirming politicians who are going to put such people in those positions. Still, all that said, it is Congress's responsibility to scrutinize executive branch policy, especially when the policy choices endanger the nation. Let's consider just some of those policy choices in the last 3.5 years. Since 2009, the Obama administration has abandoned the federal government's prior policy against dealing directly and formally with the Muslim Brotherhood. The State Department has not only been supportive of that dramatic shift, it has embraced a number of Muslim Brotherhood positions that undermine both American constitutional rights and our alliance with Israel. To name just a few manifestations of this policy sea change, the State Department has an emissary in Egypt who trains operatives of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations in democracy procedures. We're actually helping them get elected. The State Department announced that the Obama administration would be satisfied with the election of a Muslim Brotherhood-oriented government in Egypt. The State Department has collaborated with the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, a bloc of governments heavily influenced by the Brotherhood, in seeking to restrict American free speech rights in deference to Sharia prohibitions against examination and negative criticism of Islam. The State Department has excluded Israel, the world's leading target of terrorism, from its Global Counterterrorism Forum, a group that brings the United States together with several Islamist governments, prominently including its co-chair, Turkey. By the way, Erdogan's Islamist government in Turkey now finances the terrorist organization Hamas, which is the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian branch. At the Global Counterterrorism Forum's kickoff, Secretary Clinton decried various terrorist acts and various terrorist groups, but she did not mention Hamas or attacks against Israel. Transparently, this was in deference to the Islamist governments the administration has chosen to partner with, to the exclusion of Israel. Those governments adhere to the Muslim Brotherhood's position that Hamas is not a terrorist organization and terrorist attacks against Israel are not terrorism. The State Department and the Obama administration waived congressional restrictions in order to transfer about $1.5 billion in aid to Egypt after the Muslim Brotherhood's victory in the parliamentary elections. The State Department and the Obama administration waived congressional restrictions in order to transfer millions of dollars in aid to the Palestinian territories, notwithstanding that Gaza is ruled by Hamas, which again is a designated terrorist organization and the Brotherhood's Palestinian branch. And I should note that with respect to a designated terrorist organization, if an American citizen tried to provide material support, they'd be guilty of a serious felony. Speaking of which, the State Department and the administration recently hosted a contingent from Egypt's newly elected parliament that included not only Muslim Brotherhood members, but a member of the Islamic group, Jamaat al-Islamiyah. The Islamic group is the jihadist organization headed by the blind Sheikh, who, as Frank mentioned, was my defendant back in the early 90s. He's currently serving a life sentence for his leading role in the terrorist plot that not only bombed the World Trade Center, but planned an even more ambitious campaign of simultaneous attacks on New York City landmarks. Like Hamas, The Islamic group is a designated terrorist organization to which it is illegal to supply material support. Finally, on a just completed trip to Egypt, Secretary Clinton pressured the ruling military junta to hand over power to the newly elected parliament, which is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the newly elected president, Mohammed Morsi, who was a top Muslim Brotherhood official. Secretary Clinton later met with Morsi, who has also been extended the honor of an invitation to come to the White House this September. All this despite the Muslim Brotherhood's extensive record of hostility toward the United States, and despite the fact that Morsi, in his first public statement after being elected president, announced that one of his top priorities was to exert pressure on the United States to force us to free the blind Sheikh and transfer him back to Egypt. One last thing. Government agencies are responsible to police themselves to ensure that improper influences and conflicts of interest do not skew policy away from the public interest. Inspectors general are one way that agencies do that internally, and it's entirely appropriate for members of Congress to ask that inspectors general perform this role. In fact, it's probably a good way to do it because it's a way that Congress can get the information it needs without unduly interfering with the agency's performance of its mission. Congress has an obligation to ask questions and conduct oversight over executive agencies. After all, the people's representatives have created these agencies. It is Congress that funds these agencies with taxpayer dollars. What we are paying for dramatically affects our security, so Congress must examine the policies and the expenditures to protect the public interest. Under the circumstances, there would be something terribly wrong if members of Congress were not asking questions about Islamist influence on our government. And there is something terribly wrong in the fact that these 5 members of Congress are the only ones who seem to have the courage to step up to the plate. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Sir?
Mr. McCarthy. Thank you very much. My name is Bob Petruzak, and I'm a former state prosecutor. And I have always been intrigued with the chain of events that led to the seizure of the explanatory memorandum that you discussed this morning. And I have been looking at the affidavit that resulted in the issuance of the search warrant for that home in Annandale, Virginia. And I've noted that the FBI believed that there was a connection to Al-Qaeda and that the individuals who were caught on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge prior to the seizure were performing reconnaissance for Al-Qaeda. I even have the pertinent paragraphs of that affidavit with me this morning. And my question is this: should we as citizens not be concerned or even angry that since 2004, our government has not adequately investigated and prosecuted this connection with Al-Qaeda?
Well, we don't know that they haven't adequately investigated it. We have, I think, agents, particularly on the front lines, are doing what they can to investigate this pretty thoroughly. And let's not forget, we know the enemy is trying to hit us, and we have not suffered a reprise of 9/11 since it happened. So I think you don't want to undersell the energy that our agencies devote to protecting America, because they've done a pretty good job of it, I'd say, for the last 10 or 12 years. That said, the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood is very interesting. One of the items, I guess, of conventional wisdom that seems to be being sown here is that one of the things that makes the Brotherhood moderate is that they're less wild and crazy than Al-Qaeda, who wants to just kill everybody and impose Sharia on the fast track. The interesting thing is they have a very tetchy sort of relationship. The Brotherhood has a good thing going here in the United States. The nonviolent jihad is working quite well for them. I think they've made a calculation that jihadist attacks in the United States are to be avoided because they're doing perfectly well without them. They don't mind the atmosphere of intimidation that results from terrorism attacks, but they realize that when there are terrorist attacks in our country, there's going to be a significant blowback, and that will affect their operations in a negative way. On the other hand, when you're talking about American armed forces or other American presence operating inside Islamic countries, when Al-Qaeda attacks Americans in Islamic countries, the Muslim Brotherhood fully supports them. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood lauded bin Laden many times. The things that were said about bin Laden by the Brotherhood in Arabic were quite different from some of the things we heard in English. So it's an interesting connection between the two. Yes, ma'am.
Sandy Rios, AFR Talk.
Hi.
Could you say something about the purging of the training manuals for the FBI and other defense organizations? Oh, do you want me to repeat it? Do you want to get it on tape?
Yes.
Okay. Sandy Rios, AFR Talk. The question is, can you say something, Andy, about the purging of the training manuals for FBI and other agencies here to comply with Muslim Brotherhood requirements?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's wrong on just so many levels. Why, first of all, why we're taking advice from organizations that don't mean us well is baffling. The thought, let's assume for argument's sake that what you're hearing is right and that there's some outrageous stuff in the training manuals. If these are the people that we're training to protect our country from intelligence, I think they can probably be exposed to stuff and figure out what's wacky and what's for real. If they can't, I don't know why they're being trained for the jobs that they're being trained for. And finally, here's how much I think things have changed in 15 years. After the blind sheikh, the way that we prosecuted the blind sheikh was to prove that there were injunctions toward violence in the Quran. I'm not suggesting that that's all the Quran says, but what he said was in there, the blind sheikh. He would sew those injunctions into his commands to violence, which is what made them so powerful. What made him powerful, think about the blind sheikh, right? Blind, diabetic, probably bad ticker, every malady you can imagine, utterly incapable of doing anything helpful to a terrorist organization except running it. And what was his source of influence over it? It was the fact that he is not a nut, which is what they wanted to, what the government was saying back in 1993. He's a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence, graduated from Al-Azhar University, and a renowned authority on Sharia. That was what enabled him to command the organization. So we prove that we have this very influential jurist who uses these commands that are threaded through the Quran and gets his followers to commit acts of terrorism. And for that, the Clinton Justice Department brought us down to Washington and gave us, what a Prosecutor of the Year award or whatever it was. And I don't mean to belittle it. We were very honored to go down and get it. Flash forward 15 years later. People who suggest that there are commands to violence in the Quran and they are the fuel that ends up in violent extremism are now called Islamophobes. So what we used to call evidence is now basically a hate crime. And if they get their way and the First Amendment cutbacks that the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation would like to see somehow find their way into our law, it will be much harder not only to prosecute terrorism cases, but even to talk about them. Yes, sir.
Mr. McCarthy, West Vernon, Renew America. I am trying to determine, you mentioned during your dissertation here that this should become an issue, this whole thing should become an issue in the current presidential campaign.
Yes, sir.
That raises the question as to whether or not you know of or will support or will encourage or actually take the lead in any effort to get to the Romney campaign and or some of the PAC organizations that buy advertising in support of the Romney campaign? Can you give me any indication as to what we can look forward to in that regard?
Well, I think I just did what I thought needed to be said, and I have to tell you, shocking as this may seem, I don't think the Romney people get up every morning and say, gee, I wonder what Andy thinks today. In my experience, that hasn't happened. So I'm going to keep plowing away because I think it's important for the country. And
I meant, did you know of any effort?
You know, look, I think it's very obvious that this is a crucially important issue. And let me just explain why I think so, other than the obvious. If you have a serious problem, and I think we do have a serious problem that's at the very least worth investigating about influence in our country, and when you describe it to people, they think it's hair-raising. They think, my God, this is really bad. Well, the people on Capitol Hill know that better than the rank-and-file people out in the country do. And we got a situation where we got 5 members of Congress who are willing to get up and say something about it. And you know, the remainder of them seeming to sort of hold their nose and wish the whole thing would go away. Now, that's not only bad in and of itself in this one situation. What does it say the next time some information comes up that cries out to be disclosed and investigated? You know, if you're an ambitious politician in Congress, and you see what they did to Michele Bachmann and the rest of these characters, it's going to be very hard to stand up and do what needs to be done. That's why I think it's vitally important, and it would be a wonderful thing if Governor Romney did it. But it's vitally important that you know, we raise holy hell and that people stand up and be counted about this. Yes, sir.
Mal Klein, Accuracy in Academia. Question: the Salid Ramadan with the Muslim World League that you mentioned, is he related to Tariq, who they gave a visa to teach at Notre Dame?
His father, yes.
And his great-grandfather was head
Tariq Ramadan's grandfather is Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Saeed Ramadan is his father. Saeed Ramadan was married to Banna's daughter.
Okay.
Little family tree there. Yes, sir.
Yes, thanks. You acknowledge in here that Huma Abedin doesn't really have any policy role, and in fact, she's sort of the. No, you didn't. I mean.
No, I said she didn't make policy. I didn't say I made
Oh,
a
okay.
distinction between.
Well, okay, so in politics, she's essentially the body person, a personal aide who helps the Secretary of State, you know, pick out her suits and get her from meeting to meeting. So I just wanted you to explain what mechanism she would be using to exert the Muslim Brotherhood's influence on Hillary Clinton, other than maybe picking out a bad suit for her.
I don't have any evidence to corroborate your version of events that she's the body person. I do know that she managed to get Mrs. Clinton to appear at a college that her mother founded in Egypt, of all the places they could have went to. Yeah. Yeah, well, no, but they got there. And that one, by the way, also has board members who are involved in terrorism financing. Yeah, I think she did her share too.
Then we're clear.
Okay. Well, I don't think. Look, somebody says she's not a family member. You know, look, this is not a partisan problem. We're in a partisan setting right now. Look, I was very critical of the Bush administration when I think that they bent over backwards and turned a blind eye to things that they shouldn't have turned the blind eye to. I think the Obama administration's made it worse, but they hardly invented the problem. And, you know, I don't know what to say about this except that I thought I was clear, that I thought this was a real bipartisan failing. I'm very proud of the 5 people who stood up and were counted and are continuing to stand up, regardless of the fact that they've really been put through the ringer. But you know, there's some 500 other people who, you know, either haven't been heard from, or when they have been heard from, they've said the wrong things. And some of them are Republicans and some of them are Democrats. You know, I don't think, you know, stupidity doesn't seem to be a partisan condition. Yep.
Can you be more specific on the what is the danger if, like, we just open arm with give open arm to Muslim Brotherhood as a country, as a leader of the country for the president Egypt? I was just wondering if it's just peaceful open arm. Like,
Well, I guess what I don't see it as is peaceful. You know, I think that they are a committed enemy of the United States. You get that. I mean, I don't think this requires a great deal of mind reading. You get the supreme leader of the Brotherhood come out and say in October of 2010 that there ought to be violent jihad against the United States. You have Morsi coming right out of the box, taking positions that are hostile to our interests. I'm not foolish enough, I hope, to think that you don't have to deal with your enemies. My point is that you deal with them as enemies. You don't pretend that they're your friends, and I think that's a much more sensible place to start from.
But right now, they are the leader of the country, Morsi. So.
Right. Well, you know, I don't like these kind of comparisons, so I'm probably going to be mad at myself for saying it. But Hitler was the leader of a country too. You know, I mean, you know, the fact that they're a leader of a country doesn't mean that they're not our enemy. I mean, Iran is our enemy. The Muslim Brotherhood's our enemy. You know, I mean, we have to deal with them because that's the facts of life. We'd be children if we didn't think we had to deal with them. But you should deal with them as what they are, not as what you wish they were. And I think that would make us a lot safer. Yes, ma'am.
Skipping over the Hitler part, is it reasonable to look at this the way we used to look at communism? They're there. Ultimately, their goal was to replace us as well. There's a difference between going to war against them. I'm not advocating war against Egypt, but to understand who people are that don't like the way you live.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think we also, you know, we should be honest about what the history of communism was, which was that there was, you know, more infiltration than we thought. So, you know, I think that's a very good analogy, but let's make it an accurate analogy. But we are dealing with an ideology. I think in many ways the Soviet communism in particular was easier for us to deal with because when you inject the element of religion, which you have unfortunately with Islamic supremacism, because it does have some spiritual elements, even though I would argue that it's only a very small amount of what the total ideology is. But you know, I think that has made it, because of our respect for religious liberty, it's made it more difficult for us to grapple with this threat. And I think a lot of well-meaning people have gotten it wrong. But I think it's a good analogy.
Before Osama bin Laden was killed, you had an interview, I think, with Catherine Jean Lopez of National Review, suggesting that he had outlived his usefulness to the Muslim Brotherhood, and that therefore it would be okay for the Obama administration to kill him. Do you think the Obama administration killed Osama bin Laden as a favor, since, you know, he outlived his usefulness to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, whether they did or not, I consider it a personal favor to me, so I'm grateful, and I thank the president for. No, I don't think. I think, you know, Osama bin Laden was a threat to the United States. I don't know, you know, how it impacted the Muslim Brotherhood. I do think in many ways.
Suggestion that it might help them out, so I'm just wondering.
No, what I said was that he had outlived his usefulness to the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think that's true, largely.
Your suggestion was that would, therefore, it would be okay for this Islamist-influenced administration to get rid of it.
I see. So if there's 15 reasons why it was a good idea to kill bin Laden, that's the one we're going to focus on. Whatever.
The one you made. I mean, nobody else made that argument.
Okay, well, I'm a whack job, I guess. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, I mean, you can get sarcastic, but you made it. I mean, I thought it was crazy too, but then again.
Well, then we're in agreement. Look, I think Osama bin Laden did outlive his usefulness to the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know what to tell you, but that is hardly a reason why the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief in a war against Al-Qaeda, would authorize an operation to kill Al-Qaeda, to kill bin Laden. If it had a residual benefit or whatever impact it had on the Muslim Brotherhood, then that's the impact it had. What my argument is, and I continue to think that this is true, is that President Obama has been very tough on violent jihadists. And for those who mentioned the partisan issue, back during the 2008 campaign, I argued that Obama was completely right and McCain was completely wrong about Obama's promise that if Pakistan wouldn't deal with the jihadist cells in Pakistan, that he would deal with them. And McCain shrieked and said, they're our ally. How can you say such a thing? That's crazy. And I thought Obama had it exactly right. It's a good thing for the country that President Obama has been tough on violent jihadists. I think it's unfortunate that they've so botched up the issue of detention that it seems that that they sometimes kill in circumstances where we could capture and collect good intelligence. But that seems to me sometimes almost to be a quibble, because I frankly thought Obama was right when he talked about Pakistan, but I didn't believe him. So he proved me wrong. When he got in, he's been very tough on Pakistan and Yemen and in all kinds of different pockets. That said, being tough on violent jihadists has made it a lot easier for him to have maneuvering room in terms of dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I don't have in front of me, whatever it is you're quoting, but my recollection is that was what I was trying to get at. In other words, the fact that he has cracked down aggressively on violent jihadists, in many ways more aggressively than President Bush did, has made it easier for him to embrace these Muslim Brotherhood groups without having a lot of political fallout from it.
How does same-sex marriage fit into the whole Islamist agenda thing?
Same-sex marriage.
I'm just curious. You said Islamist sympathies. I mean, if the Muslim Brotherhood wants to impose Sharia law, I assume, and the Obama administration is sympathetic to that, I assume, same-sex marriage is going to have to fit in there.
I didn't say Obama wants to impose jihad.
Sympathies. You said
Yes, he has Islamist sympathies. He does.
The goal of Islamism is to impose Sharia law, and you said the Obama administration has Islamist sympathies.
All right, well, you're way too quick for me. I apologize. I just
I'm
did.
sure I'm not, though.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think you just don't like the question.
Well, look, I guess, look, there's a fair question in there someplace, and it is this. To say that Obama has Islamist sympathies is not the same as saying he's an Islamist or that he wants to impose Sharia. What it is saying is that, and I'll make a broader point about the hard left in general. There are many historical instances of leftists and Islamists working together. They exist right before our eyes now, and they've gone back, more than half a century. That doesn't mean that the two of them agree on everything. They agree on a number of core things. They're both sympathetic to the idea of a totalitarian system. It's not the same totalitarian system, but they disagree on a lot of important things too. They tend to combine with each other when they have a common enemy. But once there isn't a common enemy, they've also fought with each other pretty viciously in history. So I don't see why there's a problem with saying that Obama has Islamist sympathies and saying that he's not an Islamist. I mean, I think that's pretty elementary, but if I'm confusing on that, then, yes, sir.
Two comments. Two comments, Mr. McCarthy. One is the comment that the enemy of my enemy is my friend from the Middle East. But the other one, if you dig into WikiLeaks, what you find is that Zahari, who is Obama's deputy, had talked to the Germans. They wouldn't take him out. And so he arranged for a phone that was compromised so he could take him out. He didn't think he was strong enough and radical enough because Osama bin Laden did not want to take certain weapons of mass destruction into the country just yet. He did. It's out there. You can just dig it up.
Okay.
Nick Cementelli from Faith in Public Life. Mr. Gaffney doesn't believe that Obama was born in the United States. Also, he says there's mounting evidence that he may still be a Muslim. Do you agree with those claims?
See, I addressed as far as the Muslim business is concerned, I addressed this in my book. I don't think, since I argue most of the time that we should avoid imposing Sharia in the United States, I think the president gets the benefit of that as well. There's some evidence that he was at least raised as a Muslim when he was in Indonesia. There's some documentary evidence that corroborates that, and there's some other circumstances. So far as I know, the president has never done anything to affirm Islam as he proclaims himself to be a Christian. I don't know why we would question that. It's in Islamist ideology where they say, once we brand you as a Muslim, you're a Muslim for life, and if you try to leave, you're susceptible to or liable to the death penalty. That's not our way of thinking. So if somebody wants to run a nutty theory that Obama is a Muslim because at one time he may have been in his childhood raised as one, which I don't know to be true either, then good for them. But I think it's a stupid thing to do. I mean,
so you would describe Mr. Gaffney as running nutty theories?
No, I wouldn't.
But Mr. Gaffney believes that.
You're assuming that I'm going to accept your recitation of what he said. I don't know.
That's a direct quote. There is mounting evidence that he may still be a Muslim.
I'd rather see the quote before I say anything.
If it were true, though, you would say it's a nutty theory.
I'm not going to play that game with you. I've said what I think.
And the allegations of birtherism, that he's not born here. Do you think it's a credible question?
I think is what a credible question?
Whether he was born in the
United States? I think that he could have done a lot more to take the question off the table.
You don't think the birth certificate was enough?
No, which birth certificate?
The one he released publicly.
I'm not going to do the birth certificate. I'm here to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. Enough. No.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sir, I just want a few. Hi there. My name is Anna Skibinski. I'm from Epoch Times. I would just like a few examples of how the U.S. has trained the Muslim Brotherhood in democracy procedures that help them become elected. I believe you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, there's a guy who's a State Department official whose name escapes me at the moment, who is the Obama administration's point person for, I think they call it like point person for democratic transitions. He's given a number of interviews, I think some in the American press, but certainly in the Arabic press, where he explains that they give democracy classes in the procedures of democracy, which without having him give chapter and verse, what I take that to mean is sort of organizing political campaigns, developing election strategies, developing platforms, and the like. This is almost a direct quote, but I remember him saying, "Some days the Islamists come, and some days they don't." He is also, by the way, the official who said that the Obama administration would be, I don't want to misquote them, but it's something along the lines of satisfied with a Muslim Brotherhood victory. Okay, that's what I've got on it at the moment. Okay. Yes, sir.
Joe Himmelfarb, I'm with the Investigative Project on Terrorism. A question for you. The Center for American Progress, well-connected democratic think tank, put out a study in which they said that there's an Islamophobia industry. Includes the Center for Security Policy, my organization, the IPT, and yet some of the people who've been making these same charges are groups that are actually much larger than ours, like the American Civil Liberties Union and various other groups that are very, very well connected on the political left. What is the best way to answer these kind of charges?
Well, You know, look, I think, as I said before, Islamophobia is a fabrication by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a strategy. I mean, this is a label that they've come up with themselves, and like many of their strategies, it's quite clever, and it has worked. It backs people up who are afraid or intimidated by being subjected to that kind of smear. You know, I don't know what to advise people other than you just sort of have to tune that out and not care about it. You know, I don't care about it, so I have trouble identifying with people who do. But I understand the problem. I just, you know, I just think it's a mistake to think that you need to get into a rational argument with people who are moving a movement, not actually trying to have a good faith give and take with you. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. McCarthy, it's a pleasure being here with you today. I had a question about some comments that Secretary Clinton made in Istanbul last summer, where she said that this administration would use old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, basically, to prevent any kind of Islamophobia or, you know, threats of imminent violence. And I wanted to know, how much further down the rabbit hole are we going to go until there's a change and the tipping point where there's enough knowledge, there's enough anger, there's enough proof for us to stop this? And kind of at what point can we turn the tables?
I guess the first thing is I think it's inappropriate for the government to bully people. You know, I mean, there's plenty of peer pressure, but that's supposed to be a citizen-on-citizen thing. When it gets to be government-on-citizen, that's a big problem. You know, in my office, which I was very proud to work at for almost 20 years, the rule of the road was the government spoke when it was ready to charge somebody, and before that, you were supposed to keep your mouth shut. Now, I don't know. I'm not pretending that everybody followed that golden rule to the T every time. They certainly should have. But I think it's wrong for government. You know, government has lawful procedures in order to repress people who deserve to be repressed as a matter of law. If they haven't violated the law, if they're just exercising their constitutional rights, I think the government ought to butt out of it. And I don't think that's just the case with Secretary Clinton. You know, we've had situations where, remember the guy down in Florida who was burning the Koran, and that was creating a violent reaction in Afghanistan. You know, Senator Graham and General Petraeus had a lot to say about the guy down in Florida who was burning the Koran. Now, you know, I happen to think that that's not a good way to go about registering your dissent. I think there's a lot better ways you could do it. But the guy had a right to do it. And, you know, I think that what we ought to be more focused on is people who think it's okay to commit mass murder over the burning of a book rather than the burning of the book. So, you know, I think that's wrong. In terms of how far are we going to go, you know, I think there's going to be movement on the OIC's resolution, which does attempt, and as I understand it, the administration has been supportive of this in this Istanbul process, to try to do an end around the First Amendment in a way that would enable it to crack down on commentary about Islam. Now, I don't want to get riled up about that until I see exactly what they're going to try to do. You know, some of this may be a minuet they're doing with the OIC just to try to keep the temperature down and try to keep good relations. But some of it may be substantive and serious. So I think that's the thing to keep an eye on, what happens with that resolution. Yes, ma'am?
You don't want radicalization from the Islamists. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you do, like, to prevent the radicalization from your side or the other side of this Islamist? Because whatever people say can be inflammatory for the radical people.
Well, but they're already, you mean, how do we prevent them from being radicalized?
Yeah, I mean, like from, there's some, it says like from right-wing radical. There is like, for example, the burning a mosque or something like that, or killing other people because of from this.
Look, you know, I think I made a living doing this for a long time. When people violate the law, they ought to be prosecuted, and they ought to be, you know, and that includes incitement. There's a lot of, you know, there's a sometimes difficult line between, you know, free speech and incitement to violence, but there are legal tests, and they do work, and those people ought to be prosecuted aggressively. But I don't think that we should compromise an iota our lawful First Amendment rights because a bunch of lunatics think it's okay to commit mass murder over what in our society would be slights that are almost so insignificant they're not even worth mentioning. So you disagree with whatever accusation that whatever the extreme says, and then the action of those radical, there's connection? Look, I think there's a difference. You know, I don't think the government always has to lead everything. You know, if you got a lunatic someplace who wants to burn a Quran to call attention to himself, then, you know, I think that's the time when peer pressure, like the real peer pressure, not the government peer pressure, the real peer pressure, you know, we ought to trust that we have a good enough society that we can dissuade people from doing stupid things. But every now and then, you know, that's kind of what the First Amendment's about. You know, every now and then somebody's going to do something that's very provocative, very upsetting, in some ways almost, you know, insensitive to the point of being inhuman. And the way our society is, and the way I think we want it to remain, is we swallow hard and accept that in order to have the free exchange of points of view that we have. Yes, sir.
I have maybe a slightly tricky question, but it's, my name is Ron Thompson, but it's a follow-up on your comment about the smallness of the spiritual element in Islam. And it almost feels a little indiscreet to ask, but aren't...
Can I just, before you continue, what I meant was comparative smallness. I didn't want to, what I meant was that component of it, when you look at the totality of what Sharia would regulate. I didn't mean to suggest, and I hope I didn't, that I thought that the spiritual elements of Islam were small in the sense of being, you know, something that you would dismiss.
Okay, I'm inclined to think they are, and it leads a little bit to my question, which is, aren't good, decent, patriotic American Muslims bad Muslims? In other words, how is it possible to be a good Muslim and not be in favor of Sharia law?
There are a wide variety of interpretations of Islam, and there is a lot of courageous and creative effort that is underway in the Islamic community to try to reinterpret the aggressive passages, or to try to put them in a historical context that says that that was for then, but it's not for now.
Do you see any success with that?
There's some success. You know, there are places like Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is actually, I think, trending badly at the moment, but the practice of Islam in Indonesia is very different than the practice of Islam, generally speaking, in Saudi Arabia. Let me tell you something else from my own experience as a prosecutor doing terrorism cases. I think the big divide in the Islamic community in America is between the rank and file Muslims and the leadership of many of the mosques and the community centers. When we needed cooperation from the Islamic community in conducting our investigation, we generally got it. Now, it came with caveats, most specifically that, you know, people didn't want it to be known that they had cooperated with us. But as long as we could assure them that that didn't have to be found out, they were pretty cooperative. And the reason that they were worried about that wasn't always violence. I mean, I think there's always part of that when you're dealing with a terrorism investigation is sort of the nature of the beast. The thing that most of them were concerned about was being ostracized in their communities. And the reason for that, I think, is the rank and file people in the communities tended to be, you know, American people who happened to be Muslim. The leadership in the mosques and the community centers very often were very influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, very often had actually even come from overseas, and were preaching a much more fiery version of Islam than the people in the community might have felt comfortable with, even if they also didn't feel comfortable speaking up and objecting. So you know, I think it's a complicated situation. But first of all, I'm not a Muslim. I don't think it's for me to say what is authentic Islam. And if we were talking about something that was as simple as, you know, these guys say 2 + 2 is 4, and these guys are trying to prove that 2 + 2 is really 5, then I think, yeah, okay, you could say this is a black and white issue, and you know, these people are just wrong. As it happens, you know, we're dealing with a community of well over 1 billion people. They have many different interpretations of Islam, and there are many places where it's practiced in a way that's very benign, and the explosive parts of the scripture are seemingly irrelevant. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not there, and you know, we're seeing in Indonesia now that you know, things are going in the wrong direction, and that's worrisome. But I don't feel either competent or comfortable telling somebody who, you know, interprets Islam in a way that says that I don't need to follow these injunctions, and I can, regardless of what classical Sharia says, I can separate my spiritual life from civil society. I don't feel comfortable telling that person that, you know, gee, you're all wrong about Islam. It's not for me to say.
That's not precisely what I asked, but I appreciate your response.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Yes, sir. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious if you could address some of the criticism some critics have about the Michele Bachmann and her colleagues' letters. They've said that they should have not made it public, and that, you know, Bachmann posted on her website of her House site, and that in doing so, and then went on a conservative talk radio show to talk about it, and then in doing so, that kind of undermines the legitimacy of their claim. She's on the Intelligence Committee. She could have done this through, you know, private, secretive channels. Would you have preferred to see that?
I have to confess, I don't know enough about how it got publicized, so I can't.
Well, the letters are on her website.
No, I know they're on her website now, but I don't know that that's how they originally got publicized. I would think that if they got publicized some other way, that it would be better at that point to put them on the website just so everybody saw what they actually were rather than what they were rumored to be. But I'd be speculating. I don't know enough about how it happened.
I believe they were first published on her website, and then.
I don't know.
Fair.
Yes, ma'am. One second.
You indicated that Huma Abedin is assistant editor for the Journal of Islamic Affairs.
No, Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs.
Okay. Is that journal available online? And
I don't know. Frank probably knows this better than I do. Was it online that you were able to obtain?
It is online.
I mean, I've seen a number of passages from it online, but I don't know if I got that because somebody put it on. Frank is saying it's online, so I guess that's so. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that have appeared in that publication?
There's it's very similar from what I've seen, and realize now that this is a journal that goes back to the late 1970s, and I've seen I don't know how representative a sample, maybe, you know, 5 or 6 different editions, maybe, and not soup to nuts editions, just an article here, an article there. You know, there's some reliance on kutub. There's a lot of talk about, in what I've seen, Muslim minority communities, particularly in the West, which is interesting because it's an issue that's greatly important, particularly to Sheikh Qaradawi. One of Sheikh Qaradawi's priorities has been called, I don't think this is his characterization of it, it's been called voluntary apartheid. And the idea is that the Muslim community or Muslims move into Western countries, or countries at least that are not Muslim countries, and they get a toehold in an enclave, and then the idea would be that, you know, more and more move into the enclave, and then you put pressure on government in order to be allowed to conduct your affairs under Sharia. And as this process continues, what you've essentially done is ceded sovereignty from the governing authority of the country to the enclave and to the Muslim authority in the enclave. That is one of the big strategies for Islamizing Europe, and you know, it's worked frighteningly well in a number of places. And in fact, I think it was Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, who said that he considered assimilation, or the request that Muslim communities assimilate in the West, to be a crime against humanity. So it's a very big imperative to be allowed to, first to get a physical toehold in a place, get that to be bigger, and then establish the precedent that the territory is governed by Islamic law. And there's, you know, what I've seen in the journals, there's been, you know, some stuff about that.
So one last question.
Mr. McCarthy, would you expect at some point that people within the government might come forward as whistleblowers about the vetting processes?
You know, if the vetting processes involve classified information, I sort of hope they don't, because you know, you don't want to write something that's wrong by something that's worse. And that, again, I guess this brings us full circle to where we started, which is that the most appropriate way for this to be investigated is for Congress to investigate it. And I think that the way that these 5 representatives went about it, asking for inspectors general, at least preliminarily, to start looking into it and reporting back to Congress, was really a good way to go, because an inspector general in an agency, especially if he or she does the job right, has the capacity to conduct a competent investigation without bumping into the agency's mission left, right, and center. You know, sometimes if Congress just sort of ham-handedly decides that you know, they need to investigate something right now in some executive agency, you can really compromise the effectiveness of the mission. Whereas if you go through the Inspector General, you might find out what you want to know, and you might do it without breaking too much stuff. Yeah. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just thank Andy McCarthy for what I anticipated was going to be an extraordinary drill down on the problem, and thank all of you for being here. I just want to say on your way out, if you didn't get it in your packets, there are 2 important letters that went to the Congress, to specifically House Speaker John Boehner in the past couple of weeks, one from 17 prominent conservative figures, the other from Andy McCarthy and 4 other very, very influential figures in the intelligence and law enforcement community. With that, we thank you again for being here, and hope that you will stay tuned as more of this documentation of a very serious problem of the civilization jihad becomes available through the center, through Andy's work, and otherwise. Thank you very much.